Have you ever experienced a dream so vivid, so disturbingly lifelike, that the line between fantasy and reality seemed to melt away? My name is Ezekiel Voss, a restorer of ancient artifacts, and I'm about to share with you a story that defies reason, a tale that began as a haunting dream and spiraled into a waking nightmare. It all started innocently enough. In the late hours of a seemingly ordinary night, I drifted into a dream, but this wasn't like any I'd experienced before. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if 1,000 eyes were silently watching me from the dark recesses of some forgotten memory. As the vision took shape, I found myself standing alone in a cathedral that loomed high above, its ancient stone walls towering, closing in with each passing second. The air was thick, carrying the unsettling scent of old, damp earth mixed with something faintly metallic, like the sharp tang of blood. The silence around me was heavy, pressing into my ears until it was almost painful. But within that silence, I heard something, a faint drip, 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 echoing from deep within the cathedral. Each sound sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder that I was not alone. There, in the dim light, something felt horribly wrong, as if the very stones of the cathedral were charged with a presence that had waited centuries to be acknowledged. Shadows clung to the walls, shifting with unnatural purpose, and a cold dread filled my chest. Despite my training and years of handling ancient, eerie relics, I could feel my heart racing in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. As I took a tentative step forward, the floor beneath me felt like it was pulsing, as if something alive was buried just beneath the cold stone. My footsteps echoed, almost mocking me, each one swallowed quickly by the thick darkness surrounding me. Ahead, I saw a statue shrouded in shadow, but something about it caught my attention. It was as if the statue was breathing. I knew this was impossible, just another trick of the mind, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware of me. I dared not look away, for fear that it would move the moment I turned my back. Every fiber of my being screamed to wake up, to wrench myself from this dream, but I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized and horrified, unable to look away. In the depths of that silent cathedral, where even the air seemed hostile, a terrible realization began to form. This wasn't just a dream. It felt like an invitation, a summons from something ancient and hungry. As if sensing my fear, the statue seemed to shift, its eyes following me, though they were stone and unseeing. I tried to take a breath, to calm my racing heart, but the air was thick, almost suffocating, forcing me to stay and confront whatever horror awaited. And as I stood there, paralyzed, I could swear that the faintest trace of a smile began to creep across the statue's lips, as though it recognized me. It all began in the dead of night, under the weight of a dream that felt disturbingly real. I found myself standing before an ancient cathedral, a place I'd never seen in waking life, yet recognized with an unsettling familiarity. Towering gargoyles cast long, jagged shadows that stretched across the moonlit ground, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions that seemed to mock my presence. I felt a strange compulsion drawing me inside, as though an unseen force pulled me closer to something I couldn't quite see, but could feel. Dark, heavy waiting. Stepping through the massive doors, I was hit with a smell so overpowering it made my stomach twist. It was the odor of damp stone, mingled with the metallic stench of something old, something forgotten, and left to rot in the dark. The air was thick and tasted bitter on my tongue, almost as if it carried whispers of fear that had seeped into the very bones of the building over centuries. As I took my first steps inside, the hollow sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the immense silence that filled the cathedral, a silence so dense it felt alive, pressing down on me, almost daring me to turn back. But something urged me deeper. The dim light barely illuminated the narrow, crumbling path that stretched before me, lined with ancient, dust-covered pews. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, rhythmic sound echoed, a slow, deliberate drip, drip, drip. Each drop resonated like a heartbeat, pounding through the silence and marking time in a way that felt both ominous and deliberate. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, only that it was getting louder with every step I took, as if guiding me further into the darkness. As I moved forward, an eerie sensation began to settle over me, a feeling of déjà vu so powerful it was like a punch to the chest. I could swear I had been here before, in another life perhaps, or in some distant memory that had clawed its way out of my subconscious. Every detail, the dimness of a light, the haunting echoes, the faint scent of decay, all felt disturbingly familiar, like pieces of a nightmare I couldn't shake. My skin prickled with an unnatural cold, and I found myself instinctively glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see eyes staring back at me from the shadows. Then, as if to confirm my worst fears, the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps echoed from somewhere behind me, too faint to be certain, yet too real to ignore. Panic gripped my chest, but I pressed on, each step feeling heavier than the last, the sense of something following me growing more intense. As I neared the center of the cathedral, my foot brushed against something unexpected. Looking down, I saw scattered shards of glass on the floor, glittering faintly in the dim light. They were smeared with a dark, viscous substance, almost like dried blood. The sight sent a chill up my spine, and for a moment, I was frozen, realizing that whatever force was guiding me wasn't leading me toward salvation, but something far more sinister. As I ventured further into the cathedral's oppressive darkness, the sense of dread that had gripped me from the beginning deepened into something more sinister. The silence was no longer empty. It was alive, filled with the faintest sounds of rustling fabric, whispers too soft to catch, and an unsettling creak that seemed to echo from somewhere just beyond my line of sight. I paused, trying to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks in the ancient rafters. But deep down, I knew better. Every inch of this place felt like it was watching me, breathing alongside me, waiting for something. The shadows seemed to thicken around me, moving as if they had a will of their own, shifting each time I looked away. I caught sight of objects out of the corner of my eye. Wooden pews, old statues, relics of saints long forgotten, appearing slightly different each time I glanced back, as though they had subtly rearranged themselves. It was as if the cathedral itself was bending reality, twisting its own structure to keep me disoriented. I could feel the walls closing in, their cold presence pressing down on me, heavy with centuries of secrets and sins. The unsettling sensation that I was being watched intensified with each step, and an invisible weight bore down on my shoulders, urging me to turn around. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it, a faint glimmer of light leaking from a doorway, slightly ajar, at the far end of the cathedral. The pale, sickly glow was enough to pierce through the darkness, beckoning me forward like a lure. My heart pounded, a primal part of me screaming to run in the opposite direction, yet curiosity and a strange, inexplicable pull drew me closer. Each step toward the door felt like walking through thick mud, every part of my body protesting, but my legs moved as if guided by an unseen force. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, pushing it open to reveal what lay within. The room beyond was small and bare, except for a single, dimly flickering candle casting twisted shadows against the walls. And in the center, there it was, the statue from my dream. Even in the feeble light, I could make out its anguished face, eyes hollow and dark, streaks of red trickling down its stone cheeks like bloody tears. My breath caught, and a sickening chill spread through my veins. This was no ordinary statue. Its expression was too lifelike, its sorrow too palpable, as if it bore witness to horrors that could drive a person mad. And then, as I stared, I saw it, a subtle movement, barely perceptible, a shudder that rippled through its form. Unable to look away, I found myself rooted to the spot as the candle flickered, casting the statue's shadow across the room, distorting it into something grotesque. I could almost swear I heard it whispering, words too faint to understand, but filled with malice. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of impossibility of what I was seeing, but deep down, I knew this was no illusion. The statue wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, something ancient and malevolent trapped within. The urge to flee clawed at my instincts, but something stronger held me captive, as if the statue's gaze had latched onto my very soul. Then, as if to mock my terror, the statue's eyes seemed to darken further, filling with an abyssal void that felt like it could swallow me whole. My skin crawled, and the silence was shattered by a soft, agonized wail that seemed to echo from the depths of the cathedral itself. A cry filled with centuries of suffering and despair. As the sound faded, I took a step back, realizing that the door behind me had swung shut on its own, trapping me in the room with this weeping relic of horror. My hands trembled, and I fought the growing panic, but the oppressive feeling in the room was suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, eager to witness what would happen next, as the statue's silent, blood-streaked face bore down upon me, its sorrow morphing into something far darker, a hint of satisfaction, as if it had finally found what it had been waiting for all these years. At the heart of the room, the statue loomed larger and more menacing than before, as if it had grown in the flickering candlelight, or perhaps it was my terror warping my perception. Its face, twisted in anguish, bore those streams of thick, red tears that seemed to pulse with an unnatural vitality. But now, there was something new. Its eyes, where before they were hollow pits of stone, now they seemed alive, swirling with an unnatural darkness, as though I was staring into the depths of something ancient and unfathomably cruel. My pulse thundered in my ears, a frantic drumbeat that only heightened the silence that clung to the room like a thick fog. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and my breath came out in faint, misty clouds. The flickering candlelight seemed to shiver, casting erratic shadows that danced and warped across the walls. And then, as if drawn by some unseen force, my gaze returned to the statue's face. Slowly, agonizingly, its mouth began to part, widening into an expression of twisted sorrow that seemed to spill out into the air, filling the room with an oppressive, almost tangible weight of grief and despair. I opened my mouth to scream, but my voice failed me, as if the very sound had been stolen, devoured by the darkness that now poured from the statue's empty eyes. In a flash, I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked onto it, held by an invisible force that seemed to burrow into my mind, rooting me in place. My body felt paralyzed, frozen by the sheer terror coursing through me. And then, something unimaginable happened. The statue moved. Its arm, once rigid and lifeless, rose slowly, extending toward me with a deliberate, unnatural motion. Each movement was jagged, as if the stone itself resisted, grinding and creaking as the limb stretched out, its fingers curling into a claw-like gesture, beckoning me closer. My instinct screamed at me to run, to break free of this nightmare, but my feet were rooted to the floor, and my vision began to blur. Shadows swarmed around me, growing denser, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to close in on all sides. I could feel my heartbeat slowing, like the rhythm was being stolen, matched to the sickening drip, drip, drip that now filled the air, louder than before. My skin prickled as the scent of blood intensified, thick and choking, filling my nostrils and making it hard to breathe. In a last, desperate attempt to break free, I closed my eyes, shutting out the horror before me. But the darkness behind my eyelids offered no relief. Instead, I was assaulted by vivid flashes of memories, images that weren't mine, ancient rituals, faces twisted in agony, voices chanting in a language I couldn't understand. A haunting sensation crept over me, as if the statue's curse had seeped into my mind, binding me to its sorrow and torment. The memories grew sharper, more painful, as if they were carving themselves into my mind, each one a fragment of some unimaginable history that was now part of me. When I finally forced my eyes open, I was no longer standing in the same room. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly, reddish glow, and the statue was closer, much closer. Its hand was nearly touching my chest, its fingers cold as ice, hovering mere inches from my heart. I tried to move, but the air had thickened, like I was encased in invisible chains. In that moment, I understood the horror of the statue's curse. It didn't just feed on fear. It devoured souls, binding them to its eternal misery, one victim at a time. Then, with a sickening lurch, the room spun, and I was back in my own bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might burst. Yet, something was wrong. My skin prickled with a feeling of wrongness, like an invisible residue clinging to me. I wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare, just a terrifying trick of my mind. But as I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, I froze. There, just below my collarbone, was a faint imprint of the statue's hand, a dark mark that pulsed with a chilling reminder. This wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered in that dream had crossed over into reality, and it had left its mark on me, a silent promise that it would return. The days that followed were a blur of unease and dread, as if the nightmare had woven itself into my waking reality. No matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something unseen lurked just beyond the edges of my vision. The mark on my chest, a faint, dark outline of the statue's hand, remained cold to the touch, as if it were seared into my skin by some unholy force. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just lingering fragments of a terrible dream, but the evidence was all around me, hidden in the smallest, most chilling details. In my search for answers, I began to dig into the history of the cathedral from my dream. Scouring online forums and archives, I discovered a flood of disturbing information. Whispers of a cursed statue that was said to reside in an ancient, abandoned church just outside of town. The stories varied, each more unsettling than the last. Locals spoke in hushed tones of people who had ventured too close to the statue, only to be haunted by visions, strange marks, or, in some cases, disappear without a trace. It was as if the statue held a thirst for souls, an insatiable hunger that reached out across dreams and into reality. One night, unable to resist the pull of my growing obsession, I reached out to a local historian who had written extensively about the cathedral's dark past. When I mentioned the statue, he fell silent, his voice tight with fear as he finally spoke. "They call it the Crying Stone," he whispered, "and they say it was forged in a time of war and bloodshed, a relic of suffering meant to bind restless spirits. Those who see it in their dreams are marked, claimed by it. You've been chosen, Ezekiel." His words settled over me like a dark shroud, and I felt the room grow colder, the air thick with an invisible weight. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the statue's tear-streaked face appeared in my mind, staring at me with hollow, accusing eyes. I tried to shake the memory, but it was as though the statue had embedded itself within me, its sorrow filling the empty spaces of my mind. The mark on my chest throbbed, cold and persistent, a reminder that I was tethered to something far beyond my understanding. And then, almost as if compelled by a force beyond myself, I found myself drawn back to the online articles, scouring for anything that could give me an answer. That's when I stumbled upon an obscure, long-forgotten news article from decades ago. The story spoke of a group of people who had mysteriously vanished after visiting the cathedral, each one plagued by haunting dreams, just like mine. According to the article, one of the victims had left behind a journal, its pages filled with frantic descriptions of dreams involving the Crying Stone, the very same visions I had seen. Chills ran down my spine as I read about their experiences, each passage mirroring my own in horrifying detail. It was as if the past was repeating itself, as though I was reliving the final days of people who had already fallen victim to the statue's curse. My hands trembled as I closed the article, and an overwhelming dread settled over me. This wasn't just a nightmare I could wake from or a ghost story I could ignore. It was real, and it was coming for me. The more I read, the clearer it became that the statue was not merely a relic of sorrow, but a trap, a net cast into the minds of those who dared to dream of it. Each victim had been pulled into the cathedral's grasp, claimed by its insidious influence, and now I was next. In a last attempt to shake the feeling of doom, I left my apartment to clear my mind, but everywhere I went, the reminders were there. Statues on street corners, dark shadows flickering in my periphery, even a faint, metallic scent that seemed to follow me like a ghostly echo of the cathedral's darkness. My nightmare had seeped into reality, and the crying stone's curse was tightening its grip. I had to face it, had to confront the cathedral and the statue if I was ever to break free. But with each step I took toward that decision, the world seemed darker, more sinister, as if warning me of the horrors that awaited. Driven by an unrelenting need for answers, I made the decision that no sane person would. I had to return to the cathedral, to confront the darkness that had seeped into my life. The journey to the outskirts of town felt like a descent into a nightmare, with the sky a bruised shade of gray, casting an oppressive gloom over the landscape. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it whispers that I couldn't quite understand, yet filled me with a primal fear. By the time I arrived, the cathedral loomed before me, darker and more foreboding than I had ever imagined, like a monster waiting patiently in the shadows. As I stepped inside, that sickly, metallic scent filled my senses once again, thick and suffocating, mingling with the damp, ancient stone. The silence here was more intense, as if it were a physical thing pressing against me, eager to pull me deeper into its embrace. Shadows slithered across the walls, shifting and coiling as if they were alive. My footsteps echoed hollowly, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive weight of the air. I felt eyes on me, eyes that I couldn't see but could feel, tracking my every move, watching, waiting. It was then that I encountered Jonathan, a local historian I had reached out to in desperation, hoping to gain some insight into the crying stone. I was shocked to see him there, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes wide with an expression that could only be described as haunted. He had the look of someone who had stared into the abyss and felt it stare back. Without a word, he motioned for me to follow, leading me deeper into the cathedral's labyrinthine passages. He moved with a nervous urgency, glancing over his shoulder every few steps, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. As we walked, Jonathan began to speak in a low, trembling voice, recounting his own encounters with the statue. He told me of nights plagued by dreams too vivid, too real to ignore, dreams that had driven him to the edge of madness. The statue, he said, wasn't merely an object of horror. It was a sentinel of something older, darker, an ancient, vengeful spirit that claimed those who dared enter its domain. "It doesn't just watch you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It binds itself to your soul. It shows you things, memories that aren't your own, but somehow they become part of you." His words sent a chill through my bones, but there was something else, an almost sinister comfort in knowing that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. Our footsteps eventually brought us to the room where I had first encountered the statue. I could feel its presence before I even saw it, an overwhelming sense of dread creeping up my spine. The air grew colder, heavier, as though saturated with an energy that clawed at my mind, desperate to consume me. And there it was, the crying stone, just as I remembered, yet somehow more terrifying in the flesh. As I stood there, transfixed, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered journal. "This belonged to one of the others," he said quietly, placing it in my trembling hands. Its pages were filled with frantic, disjointed scrawls, describing dreams and visions disturbingly similar to my own, as if I were reading a twisted reflection of my own experiences. Flipping through, I found the same symbols I had seen in my dreams, symbols that seemed to pulse with a dark power, pulling me deeper into the mystery of the statue's curse. Then, in an almost inaudible whisper, Jonathan revealed the truth. Each person who had dreamt of the statue had faced a choice that would decide whether they would be consumed or set free. But he had never found out what the choice entailed. All he knew was that those who failed to understand the crying stone's message disappeared, leaving behind only faint, ghostly impressions, marks like the one on my chest. I could feel a cold dread creeping into my soul as I realized the gravity of his words. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a trap, a test. As Jonathan spoke, I sensed a shift in the room. The shadows grew darker, thicker, and the statue's empty eyes seemed to focus on me, boring into my soul with an intensity that left me paralyzed. The candlelight flickered, casting twisted shadows across the walls, as if the cathedral itself had come alive, eager to witness what would unfold next. Jonathan's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "We're not alone here. It knows we're here, and it's waiting." He took a shaky step back, his eyes darting to the exit, yet he made no move to leave, as if some dark compulsion held him in place. A faint, ominous sound filled the air, a slow, echoing creak, like the groaning of ancient wood under immense pressure. The statue's face seemed to change, its sorrow twisting into something darker, almost mocking. I could feel its cold grip tightening around my soul, a silent promise that it would not let me go without extracting its price. At the heart of the cathedral, in the dimly lit chamber where the crying stone loomed over us, I felt the walls close in, as if the building itself were alive and tightening its grip, trapping us inside. The statue's gaze bore into me, hollow and endless, like staring into the mouth of an abyss that would swallow me whole. As Jonathan and I stood frozen in the dark, the air thickened, oppressive and suffocating, charged with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The room pulsed with a silent, malevolent heartbeat, matching my own as terror rooted me to the spot. And then, as if called forth by our fear, I saw it, a symbol carved into the base of the statue, faintly glowing with an eerie, crimson light that flickered like a dying ember. It was the same symbol I'd seen in my dreams, the same that had appeared in the journal, and an insidious realization crept over me. This wasn't merely a carving. It was a seal, a mark of something ancient and unspeakably dark, a relic bound by centuries of sorrow, a conduit for something waiting to be unleashed. My chest tightened as the cold mark on my skin began to burn, pulsing in rhythm with the statue's cursed energy. Jonathan's face twisted in fear as he noticed the change in my expression, and I could see the realization dawn in his eyes. This wasn't just a place of horror, it was a prison. "The choice," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's asking for a choice, to accept its mark, or to fight it." But as the words left his lips, I felt a sudden, bone-chilling presence behind me, an icy grip brushing the back of my neck, like a dead man's touch. I dared not turn, but I could sense it, something twisted and malevolent, lurking just outside my vision, waiting with a patience that defied human understanding. Desperation clawed at my mind. I knew that whatever I did next would determine my fate. The statue's eyes seemed to narrow, as if aware of my inner turmoil, and then, slowly, its mouth opened, a silent scream filling the room with an invisible pressure that pressed against my skull, seeping into my thoughts. Memories not my own flooded my mind, flashes of faces twisted in anguish, of hands clawing at the air, of silent pleas for mercy that went unanswered. It was as though the souls of every person who had ever entered this cursed place were trapped within the stone, bound by the same force that now targeted me. With a trembling hand, I reached for the journal Jonathan had given me, flipping desperately through its pages, searching for some answer, some key to unlock the mystery and break the curse. My vision blurred as I read the final entries, scrawled in frantic, jagged handwriting. "The choice is made in silence. Look into the eyes, accept the sorrow, or refuse, and become one of them." My heart pounded as the horrible truth sunk in. I had to face it. I had to look into the depths of the statue's eyes, to confront the darkness head-on, or risk losing myself forever. As I raised my gaze, Jonathan grabbed my arm, his face pale, terror-stricken. "Don't do it, Ezekiel," he begged, his voice thick with fear. "It will take you. It takes everyone who looks." But his words were lost to me, drowned out by a force far stronger, a pull that felt as though my very soul was being dragged forward, compelled to lock eyes with the stone face before me. I took a hesitant step closer, and the shadows around us thickened, writhing like serpents, twisting and shifting as if eagerly awaiting my decision. In that final, agonizing moment, I felt the weight of every choice I'd ever made in my life. The statue's face was no longer merely sorrowful. It seemed alive, a thing of both pity and loathing, demanding that I surrender, to either accept its curse willingly or become one of the forsaken shadows that haunted this place. And then, with a slow exhale, I forced myself to look directly into its eyes, allowing the darkness to wash over me. Time seemed to stop, reality unraveling around me as a cold, unimaginable grief seeped into my soul. It was more than just fear. It was an ancient sorrow, a void filled with lost lives and broken promises. A scream built within me, yet I couldn't make a sound. My vision blurred, and in that fracture moment, I felt my spirit split in two, tethered to the crying stone, yet fighting to stay whole. And then, silence. The world spun back into focus with a jolt. I was lying on a hospital bed, my body drenched in sweat, my muscles aching as if I'd been trapped in a vice. The sterile lights overhead felt harsh, too bright, casting unforgiving shadows that seemed to dance at the edge of my vision. Nurses and doctors moved around me, their faces expressionless, their voices echoing in a low hum that barely registered. My head throbbed, and every sound felt distorted, muffled, like I was listening through layers of static. As I reached up, wincing, my fingers brushed against the cold, dark mark on my chest, the imprint left by the crying stone. A feeling of horror welled up as I realized that, whatever happened in that cathedral, it wasn't over. The doctors informed me I'd been found collapsed on the road outside the cathedral grounds, unconscious and alone. But I couldn't remember leaving. My last memory was standing in that dim chamber, staring into the statue's eyes as the shadows closed in around me. The rest was a blur, a nauseating, twisting mess of terror and sorrow that lingered in my mind like a stain I couldn't wash away. I tried to piece together fragments, but each thought felt slippery, as though my memories were covered in a dark fog, refusing to reveal themselves. All I knew for certain was that the mark on my chest pulsed, a silent reminder that I was no longer alone. In the days that followed, the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. No matter where I was, at home, on the street, even under the bright lights of a grocery store, I felt its presence. The shadows seemed thicker, darker, moving just out of the corner of my eye. Strange things began happening around me. Mirrors would fog over, even when there was no steam. The faint, metallic scent from the cathedral lingered in my apartment, filling my lungs with dread. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, but deep down I knew. Something had followed me out of that place, something that wasn't bound by walls or distance. Then came the visions. They would strike without warning, brief flashes that left me disoriented and breathless. I'd see faces contorted in pain, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with despair. They'd appear in reflections, in mirrors, windows, even puddles on the sidewalk, staring back at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But the worst part was that, among those tortured faces, I sometimes caught a glimpse of my own, twisted in the same haunted expression. Each vision ended with a faint echo of a drip, 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 like the sound of blood falling onto cold stone. One night, as I lay in bed, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't shake, I noticed something even more disturbing. The faint outline of the symbol, the same one carved into the statue's base, had begun to appear around my apartment, etched into walls, appearing in random patterns on my floors, scrawled across the bathroom mirror in condensation. The more I tried to scrub them away, the clearer they became, as though the very act of acknowledging them strengthened their presence. It was as if the cathedral, or whatever darkness lurked within, was reaching out, pulling me back into its grasp, piece by piece. Desperate, I returned to the notes and journals Jonathan had given me, hoping to find some answer, some way to sever the connection. One entry caught my eye, a passage that spoke of the final test, an encounter with the crying stone that would decide whether one could escape or be claimed forever. But it offered no details, only cryptic warnings about the importance of memory and willpower, of facing the darkness within. I felt a chill as I realized that this wasn't just a haunting. It was a curse, a lingering stain that marked the soul, slowly consuming it with despair. In a moment of dark clarity, I knew I had to return to the cathedral. It was the only way to end the nightmare, to confront whatever horror I had awakened. The drive back felt endless, each mile stretching like a final march towards something inevitable. When I arrived, the cathedral was just as I had left it, looming in the shadows, its stone facade cracked and ancient, almost as if it was alive, breathing, waiting. The doors opened with a low creak, and as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of metal and decay filled my senses, welcoming me back. The statue was there, as if it had been waiting. The shadows around it seemed to throb, stretching and contracting like a beating heart. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, feeling the weight of its gaze lock onto me once more. My own reflection stared back at me in those empty, hollow eyes, and I knew this was the end. This time, I was not a visitor, but a prisoner. What happened next is a blur, a dark, fragmented memory I can barely recall. I remember the feeling of sinking, of falling into a void that was neither dream nor reality. The last thing I saw was the statue's face, smiling faintly, as if satisfied, before everything went black. I awoke hours later, lying on the cathedral floor, the mark on my chest now pulsing with a cold, sickly glow. The doctor said it was just another blackout, another strange coincidence, but I knew the truth. Whatever had claimed me had left a part of itself within me. Since that night, the visions have only grown stronger. The symbol appears everywhere I go, inescapable, and the shadows whisper my name in voices I almost recognize. I am no longer sure where the nightmare ends and reality begins. Perhaps I never left that cathedral, or perhaps a piece of me is still there, trapped within the crying stone. All I know is that it waits, always watching, ready to claim anyone brave or foolish enough to enter.